Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to our event this afternoon, blending into this evening. We are here for a panel discussion on the subject, The View from the Mountaintop, ? President Obama and Racial Politics in America. And this event is brought to you by the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence, by the Share the Vision Committee, and also by the Center for Public Policy. And I would like to put out a little plea here as a way to communicate with you in the future. If you happen to be one of those who has the cell phones with the texting technology and you're comfortable with it, then I strongly encourage you to text the word Inamori, which you can see on our podium here, Inamori, to the number 95495. Because if you do that, we'll be able to tell you with text messages about other great events like this one. So, trying to come into the 21st century slowly but surely. All right, now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you two outstanding scholars who we are really privileged to have with us here today. Professor Marty Gilens comes to us from the Political Science Department at Princeton University. He is the author of Why Americans Hate Welfare, Race, Media, and the Politics of Anti-Poverty Policy, and has published on media, race, gender, and welfare politics. He holds a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and taught at Yale University and UCLA before joining the faculty at Princeton. His research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and the Social Science Research Council. Dr. Peniel Joseph is a professor of Afro-American Studies and History at Brandeis University. His book, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, was the Washington Post Book World Best Nonfiction Book for 2006. It also received other honors, including the inaugural W.E.B. Du Bois Book Award from the Northeastern Black Studies Alliance, and was the Boston Globe paperback bestseller. He is currently working on a biography of civil rights and Black Power activist Kwame Ture, and a study of post-war African American history. He's also a frequent national commentator on civil rights, race, and democracy issues, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Chronicle Review, and the Washington Post, and elsewhere. He's received fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the Ford Foundation, and during the 2008 Democratic and Republican conventions, he served as a historian for PBS's NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. The moderator for today's event is Case Western's very own Professor Joe White, Chair of the Department of Political Science, the Luxembourg Family Professor of Public Policy, and Director of the Center of Policy Studies. And I would also like to note that after the event, we do have Dr. Joseph's book out in the lobby, and he has agreed to sign copies for you if you are interested at the conclusion of our performance here today. So thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy.
Well, thank you all for coming out, and thanks to Professors French and White for putting this event together, and thanks to Case Western University for supporting it. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about this really very remarkable historical event that we've all just witnessed. It is right to savor this moment, to celebrate it. And it's just been a beautiful thing to see sort of how broadly the country has come together, how enthusiastically in the last couple of days to celebrate really a milestone in American history. Can I have the slide, please? New York Times a couple days ago published this picture on the front page of their arts section, Bruce Springsteen performing at the Lincoln Memorial with a multiracial choir. Even advertisers have come on board with the sort of sense of unity that the Obama inauguration has generated. Pepsi and Bloomingdale's are advertising things like hope and freedom. Next slide, please. Coca-Cola has been running this multiracial celebratory ad, and so on. But without taking anything away from the enormity of this occasion, we should resist the urge to read too much into an outcome that easily could have been otherwise. Right? So if a few Democratic primary voters had made a different decision a few months ago, then we would probably be here today talking about what the Hillary Clinton administration shows us about changes in attitudes towards women and gender equality and so on. Well, we might not be here talking about it, but somebody would be. So elections are never about just one thing. And while Obama's victory certainly owes something to changes in racial attitudes in this country, as well as to his ability to minimize the role of race and racial policy in the election, there are other factors that likely played a larger role in his victory. Some of them are specific to him, right, like the quality of the campaign that he ran, and some have nothing to do with him at all. So, for example, we know that economic conditions are very important in understanding presidential election outcomes. Slide, please. So this slide shows you the relationship between economic performance and the votes that the president's party, the incumbent party, received in each of the elections between 1952 and 2004. And as you can see, there's a remarkably strong relationship here. So at the top right of the screen, during good times like 1964 or 1972, the incumbent's party did extremely well. And those were the Johnson landslide over Goldwater in 64 and Nixon's trouncing of McGovern in 1972. On the other hand, when times are bad, as they were in 1980, the bottom left, the incumbent candidate, in this case Jimmy Carter, got beat badly by Ronald Reagan. Now, 2008, slide please, fits in perfectly with this relationship. That is to say, based on predictions from the economy, Obama did about as well as one would predict a Democratic candidate would do under the conditions that existed this year. But to say that a black candidate for president did about as well as one would expect a candidate from his party to do is itself a remarkable thing. This is not something that could have happened 40 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago. So, next slide. This slide shows the responses of survey respondents when asked, if your party nominated a generally well-qualified person for president who happened to be black, would you vote for him? Actually, it doesn't say him, it says for that person. And these show the changes in responses to that question from 1958 till 2003. Well, as you can see, in the early 60s and the 1950s, about as many people said no as yes. And starting in the late 1960s, the proportion of people who said that they would not vote for a black candidate for president declined until in the last 10 or 15 years or so, it's down to about 4 to 6% or so. Now, this shows you what respondents to surveys say they would do in a situation like this. But there's lots of debate going back decades now among scholars of racial attitudes about whether the changes that we see in non-blacks' responses to these questions about African Americans, in particular the changes in those responses over the past decades, reflect real changes in beliefs and feelings towards blacks, or whether they represent changing norms of what it's acceptable to say in the context of a survey. One aspect of that difference between true beliefs, or in this case behavior, and what people say to survey takers is the so-called Bradley effect. right, which is the well-documented tendency for African American candidates to do better in pre-election polls than they actually do on election day at the ballot box. And this was named after Tom Bradley, the Los Angeles mayor, who in 1982 was running for governor of California, was ahead substantially in the polls, and lost narrowly on election day. And the belief is that there are enough survey respondents who plan to vote against the black candidate but are reluctant to admit that to the survey taker, that you get this discrepancy between the poll results or the survey results and the votes. Well, the analyses of elections with black candidates since the early 80s shows that that tendency, the Bradley effect, has diminished over time. And in fact, so much so that within the last 10 or 12 years, there's really no evidence of a difference between what people say who they say they'll vote for in a biracial race with a black candidate and a non-black candidate, and the outcome of those elections. And there's no evidence from the 2008 presidential election that Obama did any worse at the ballot box than he did in the polls. Now, of course, there are some individual cases, like New Hampshire, where that happened, but there are other states where the difference was just as large in the other direction, and overall the analyses suggest that there was no Bradley effect for Obama. In fact, there's growing evidence that a substantial number of white Americans put a positive value on racial equality, don't view race relations as a zero-sum game, and are proud that the country is doing a better job of living out its ideals of equal opportunity. So how did racial attitudes impact voting in the 2008 election? Well, one window onto that question is to look at the relationship between racial attitudes and presidential voting over the past few elections. Slide, please. I realize the print's a little small on this, but what we've got here are the elections between 1988 and 2004. And the slope of this line represents the strength of the relationship between racial attitudes along the horizontal axis and voting for the Republican presidential candidate along the vertical axis, with voters aligned with the most positive views of African Americans on the left side of each graph and the most negative views on the right. So there's a tendency then across all of these elections for voters who have more negative views of blacks to be more likely to vote for Republicans for president. And this is taking into account people's education, age, race, what part of the country they live in, and so on. Now, that relationship's not too surprising. The Democratic Party has been associated with racially liberal policies, as well as with African American constituents, at least since the mid-1960s, and to some degree since the 1930s. So we would expect some sort of a relationship like this. Next slide. This last chart shows the same analysis for the 2008 presidential election with two separate lines. This is from a survey that was taken during the primaries, and respondents were asked if the election was between Hillary Clinton and John McCain, who would you vote for? And if the election was between Barack Obama and John McCain, who would you vote for? The top line, the more shallow line in that last graph there, represents the Clinton versus McCain question and shows the same relationship that we saw in previous elections. That is to say, those with the most negative views of blacks are also the most likely to say that they would vote for McCain over Clinton if that was the choice they were offered. Now, not surprisingly, the second line on this graph, which shows that same relationship but for the choice of Obama versus McCain, is a steeper line. There's a stronger relationship, as you would expect with a black candidate, between voters' racial attitudes and their presidential candidate preference. But what's most interesting about this slide is that most of the difference between the Obama-McCain choice and the Clinton-McCain choice comes not from people on the right side of the slide, who are the most racially conservative and hold the most negative views of African Americans, but rather from people on the left side of the slide, who are the most racially liberal and hold the most positive views of African Americans. Well, who are these racially liberal white voters who would be more likely to vote for Obama if offered the choice versus McCain than for Clinton versus McCain? Well, they tend to be more educated, younger, urban, living outside the South, and so on. And in fact, young people were much more likely to vote for Obama than their elders. Slide, please. This shows for 4 age groups the proportion from exit polls saying that they voted for McCain versus Obama. As you can see, in the youngest age group here, between 18 and 29, there's an overwhelming preference for Obama. Almost 70% of young people voted for Obama in this election. As age increases, the support for Obama declines, such that among those 65 or older, McCain actually received a majority of the votes. Now, not all of this relationship is explained by Obama's race. Right? Obama was young himself, in conspicuous contrast to his opponent. And young people are sort of less rooted politically. They have less strong partisan attachments and so are more open to the conditions of the given election, which in this case favored the Democrats and Obama. But it's also true that young people tend to be more racially liberal and hold more positive attitudes toward African Americans. They're more open toward interracial friendships, dating, and marriage, and so on. Now, earlier I showed you changes over the past 5 or 6 decades in the proportion of Americans saying they'd be willing to vote for a black person for president. Next slide. These show changes over only the last 30 years or so in 2 other racial attitude measures. So the red line on this slide shows the proportion of white survey respondents who say that whites have a right to a racially segregated neighborhood. And the blue line shows the proportion of white survey respondents saying that they favor a law against racial intermarriage. And as you can see, about 40% of white respondents in the early 1970s favored both of these points of view. That's declined rather dramatically over time. But it hasn't disappeared. And where we do still see these kind of sentiments tends to be among older non-black Americans. Slide. So here's these same 2 questions, but broken down for the most recent time period, the most recent year that the data was collected, broken down by age. And as you can see, the sentiments for favoring laws against interracial marriage is much more prominent among older white Americans, as is the belief that whites have a right to a segregated neighborhood. Now, it's a cliche to say that the youth are our future, but it's also true. And over time, the Americans who hold the most negative views of blacks are dying. That's what happens when you get old. And they're being replaced by new generations who do hold much more liberal racial attitudes. So have we reached the mountaintop then? Can we see the promised land? Well, not only do we have a black president for the first time in American history, but we have a remarkably popular black president. Now, he's just taken office, of course, but Obama is coming into office with the highest favorability ratings of any president that's been surveyed, and that goes back to Reagan in 1981. And even Michelle Obama has the highest favorability ratings of any first lady going back for those 30 years. Slide, please. Now, this is an enormous achievement for the Obamas. It's also an enormous achievement for America. On the other hand, if the promised land is a place where people are judged by the content of their character and not their race or their sex or their religion, well, then that promised land is still in the far distant future. And if the promised land is a place where racial inequalities in income and wealth and education and health care are eliminated, Well, that promised land is far in the future. But I don't think it's crazy to think that such a land exists out there and that we're moving towards it, fitfully, too slowly, not always in the right direction, but overall that we are moving towards it. And this milestone of our first African American president both reflects how far we've come and I think will help to speed our progress along that road. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gilens, and it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Joseph to the podium.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to thank the Inamori Center, hope I'm pronouncing that right, for facilitating this visit. Thank Shannon and Joe. And to also thank my colleague, Rhonda Williams, who I've known for a long time, who helped facilitate this as well, and mentioned my name as an appropriate guest. Like Professor Gilens was saying, if Hillary Clinton had won, it would have been a whole new world, and that could have happened very easily in the primaries. What I want to talk about for 20 minutes tops is what does this all mean? This whole notion of Obama and post-race. The New York Times had an article a few months ago by Matt Bai, was the election of Obama the end of black politics, right? Do we need affirmative action? Do we need to even talk about race? One of the interesting things about election night and then yesterday was that many commentators really found it hard to talk about race, and I think that's remarkable. They kept saying things like, I saw David Gregory, who's the new host of Meet the Press, say things like, well, okay, this is a great day, and certainly it's historic because he's black, but it's even bigger than that. You know what I mean? It's not just because he's black, right? So we've always had a hard time discussing race in this country, and really, in March of 2008, when then Senator Obama made his famous race speech, that was probably the most open and candid discussion of race that we've had at the national level since the late 1960s and early 70s. So what I'm going to try to do is to try to put this election in a historical context, in a broader historical sweep of post-war American history. And I'm going to do dates and names, but I'm not a political scientist, so I don't have charts and graphs. I'm a historian, so I do it the old-fashioned way. You're either riveting or you're not. You're either riveted by the information or you are not. And please don't pelt me with fruit or eggs if you're not riveted. When we think about Barack Obama as the 44th President of the United States, and of course, in the inaugural address yesterday, he made the common error of saying that he was the 44th person to hold the office, even though he's really only the 43rd, because Grover Cleveland counts as 22 and 24, which is the only person to be elected to non-consecutive terms in our nation's history. But when we think about that inaugural speech, I think the inaugural speech, the three references to race are very, very important, and I want to sort of go back to them and place this in a larger context. He talked about those who had felt the lash of the whip in the first paragraph of his inaugural speech. That's the first one. The second, he talked about the United States of America having tasted the bitter pill of civil war and segregation. That's the second part. And then finally, the third part, he said that less than 60 years ago, and he really should have said less than 45. As a history professor, I'm saying, come on, you're Occidental, Columbia, and Harvard, and you don't get the fact that the Voting Rights Act was passed just August 6, 1965, and then 5 days later, the Watts section of South Central Los Angeles explodes in 7 days of fury against a long legacy of racial and social and political injustice and inequality. But really less than 44 years ago, his father would have been, and he said perhaps, and I wanted to tell him again, Mr. President, no perhaps. I've seen how dark your father looked, unless he was pretending to be an African dignitary, like some civil rights workers did in the early 60s. They pretended to be African dignitaries, and at times they could get into restaurants, and they really would publicize this to shame officials in D.C. and along I-40 in Baltimore, to try to shame and embarrass them over the fact that American citizens who happened to be black could not get access to public facilities and accommodations along the nation's capital. So those are the three references to race. And I think that's very, very important, because I think this was a president who, as a candidate, for reasons that some people agreed with and reasons that others disagreed with, was really loath to talk about race, except for the March 2008 speech, where he talked about race probably in greater depth than politicians usually talk about it. Because I'm not going to be hyperbolic as a historian and say it's the greatest speech on race in the 20th century. It was not, or the 21st century. But it was really a candid speech for a politician running for president, right? So we can say that. He was really loath to talk about race other than in the wake of the Jeremiah Wright controversy. And I think his discussion of race is very important to connect with the moment we're in now. The first thing I want to discuss very briefly is the fact that when he talked about the antebellum slavery period, that's a period in American history that's rarely discussed, and it's really astounding because it actually shapes American democracy in both ways that are triumphant and ways that are tragic. I think it's important for us to always remember that the period of antebellum slavery that really doesn't end until 1865 is a foundational part of American democracy, and the legacy of the antebellum period continues to shape the choices and strategies and public policy that we inherit, whether it's the New Deal, whether it's residential segregation, whether it's the difference between public policy towards people in urban and rural areas in the Southwest. This is all connected to that legacy. And I think what was interesting about the speech is that what he tried to craft in that speech, and I think civil rights and black power activists have tried to do this in their own ways as well, is to look at American democracy as a work in progress, something that's evolving and something that's a mosaic, right? So one of the interesting parts of the race speech in March of 2008 is when he said what he was critical of Reverend Wright and Reverend Wright's perspective of America was that he felt that Reverend Wright's perspective was too static. It was too unchanging. Because in fact, things do change and things do evolve. Now, on one level, the symbolism of Obama, the monumental symbolism, may make us all bask in an unearned victory and an unearned celebration, meaning that while the symbolism is monumental, there are huge substantive problems when it comes to racial inequality in the United States at all levels of society, from prison to higher education, from health care to the neighborhoods we live in. And I want to put that in a larger context when he talks about the second reference to race, about the bitter pill of civil war and segregation. And I think segregation is something that the United States is still grappling with today. Sometimes we refer to it as de facto segregation, which is really an abstraction. There was de jure, which was by law, and now we talk about de facto, by choice. But these aren't really choices. When we think about residential segregation, when we think about school segregation, it's really not that people decide that they don't want to live next to each other or don't want to go to school next to each other. There's a whole range of public policy that impacts people's educational options, their economic options, their employment options, their health care options that continue to foster a rigid line of segregation in America. It's not the old-fashioned version or traditional version of Jim Crow, but segregation is alive and well. And when we think about segregation, we think about the civil rights movement. And briefly, I want to give us a short history lesson on the civil rights movement, talk about black power, and then jump back to the contemporary period. When we think about the civil rights movement in the United States, we usually just think of the heroic period of the civil rights movement. And by heroic period, I'm talking about the period between May 17, 1954 and August 6, 1965. And what's interesting is that President Obama also thinks about the civil rights movement in this way. And since he's really a rare president who, before he became president, at a relatively early age of 35, 36, published his own autobiography, Dreams from My Father. Since it was reissued in 2004, we can get a glimpse into his perspective and what he feels about American history. And the newsreel-like summary of 54 to 65 is really as follows. Remember, May 17, 1954 is the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas desegregation decision. August 28, 1955 is Emmett Till's assassination, and Emmett Till was the 14-year-old black boy from Chicago who's lynched in Money, Mississippi for really just saying bye baby to the wife of a white store owner. Till's body is found in the Tallahatchie River with a 125-pound cotton gin fan belt tied around his neck. What's important for us about Till is two things. One, his mother, Mamie Mobley Till, actually allows his body to be photographed in an open casket. And that mutilated body becomes one of the most iconic pictures of the civil rights era and is on the cover of Jet magazine, which is the black working class magazine of the late 1950s, continues to this day. The second part is that Till's assailants are acquitted in a court of law and then sell their story to Look magazine for $4,000, where they divulge the fact that they were in fact guilty and had assassinated him. So that's a big part of this period. 1955 to 56, the 13-month bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, which is not led by, but the spokesperson for that bus boycott is a 26-year-old Ph.D. from Boston University named Martin Luther King Jr. 1957, Little Rock Central High School and the Little Rock, Arkansas crisis. 1960, 4 black students stage a sit-in at a Woolworths counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and that ignites a sit-in movement and creates an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. SNCC is the most important grassroots, bottom-up organization of the post-war era and really unleashes second-wave white and black feminism, unleashes aspects of black nationalism and aspects of the new left political radicalism that we're going to see in the 1960s. 1962, James Meredith attempts to enroll at Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. Mississippi explodes in 3 days of rioting at the prospect of enrolling their first black student. And 63 is really just a year of violence from top to bottom. We most often remember 63 for both the March on Washington and the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, but the spring of 63 is really the spring of Birmingham, Alabama, the last time Martin Luther King Jr. actually stays in jail overnight, and where he pens the famous letter from a Birmingham jail where he argues that the reason why the civil rights movement can't wait and black equality cannot wait is because waiting actually defames and distorts American democracy. August 28, 1963, obviously, is the March on Washington, and on September 16th of that year, 4 black girls in Birmingham, Alabama are murdered by terrorists while attending church services at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. 64, we see the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and of course, August 6, 1965, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And basically, that's the neat newsreel-like summary of the civil rights movement and its heroic period. The problem with that perspective of civil rights is that it really doesn't give us a longer view and a longer vision of civil rights. By the time we get to 65 and 66, the story or the narrative goes, black power militants and angry activists really destroyed Dr. King's vision and version of a beloved community. right? We've got Black Panthers and gun-toting militants who practice politics without portfolio and drag down a more promising movement for social justice. And of course, we've got the neat polarities between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Malcolm is the firebrand and what people call a prophet of rage, right? And throughout the whole election, one of the interesting things about Obama was the one aspect that you never saw, and he said it the other day when he was at the homeless shelter, he never let the public see him sweat. Never let the public see him angry. He could not be an angry black man because an angry black man evokes Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, black people who are boogeymen, who scare the hell out of white America and who would never be elected president, right? What I'd like to do for a few minutes is really revise that narrative. When we think about civil rights and black power, instead of thinking of them or thinking about them as mutually exclusive, to really see the interconnectedness between those two movements. And once we see that interconnectedness, one of the things I'd like to argue and set about a proposition is that really in this election and the rise of Barack Obama shows us aspects of both of those legacies, meaning that without both aspects of that movement, there would be no Barack Obama. When we think about the Black Power movement, the Black Power movement is really a movement for radical political self-determination. Sometimes people say, well, what did the Black Power folks want? You know, did they hate white people? They wanted racial separation. They're so angry. You see the pictures and the images of Malcolm X in the early 1960s. They rarely show Malcolm smiling, even though he had a wonderful sense of humor, if you're a historian of Malcolm X. They show him really angry. When you look at Stokely Carmichael unleashes the term Black Power on June 16, 1966, at a civil rights rally in Greenwood, Mississippi, and they usually show Stokely Carmichael very, 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 very angry. So for a moment, what I'd like to do is to rethink the way in which we imagine that period. When we look at post-war American democracy, what we see about American democracy in the post-war era, and when I say post-war, I'm thinking about the long post-war, so really Great Depression, the 1930s included, and the 1940s. What we see is a movement for social justice at the domestic, at the local, national, and international level that's really going to be sparked by crisis. On the one level, there's the economic crisis of the Great Depression at the domestic level. At the international level, it's the crisis of fascism and the notion that there needs to be a double V campaign. One of the things that black activists during the war are going to talk about is victory over fascism abroad and victory over racial segregation and Jim Crow in the United States. So when we think about civil rights doesn't start with Dr. King in the 1950s. If anything, our modern civil rights movement is really based in a freedom surge that comes across during the post-war period that really argues for radical democracy. And it's a movement that stretches from Harlem, New York, to the shop floors of industrializing Detroit, to Dixie's cradle of Birmingham, Alabama, out west to the post-war boom cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland. What's important about that post-war boom period is that civil rights, black power, these terms were not yet in vogue, but what black and white activists were talking about were a whole range of not reforms, but radical measures to transform American democracy. Now, two words are going to transform this period, and that's the Cold War, right? The Cold War is really a hard piece through the threat of global nuclear warfare, and it's going to marginalize the freedom dreams of that post-war period. So when we look at someone like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and even the NAACP, what they're doing in the 1950s and 1960s is coming to an accommodation with Cold War liberalism that defines movements for racial equality as movements that are subversive, that defines movements that connect the domestic with the global as movements that are anti-democratic. So when we look at the heroic period of the civil rights movement, when we think about somebody like Malcolm X becomes a leader in New York City, in Chicago, in Detroit, of a parallel movement with no name that is really vociferously criticizing democracy's jagged edges of poverty, of police brutality, of unemployment, and of drug abuse and drugs flooding into urban communities all across the East and West Coast. Briefly, the third point, Obama talked about the fact that his father, less than 60 years ago, could not be seated at a restaurant in the Washington, D.C. area. What's really very, very crucial and important when we think about the victories of the Civil Rights Movement is that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act provide a context for a new generation of African American elected officials. But for that first generation that comes to office in the late 60s and the 1970s, and we're thinking about the Congressional Black Caucus, which has about 13 congressmen and 1 congresswoman, Shirley Chisholm from Brooklyn, who runs for president in 1972, and the whole host of mayors that are elected, starting in 1967 with Richard Hatcher in Gary, Indiana, and Carl Stokes in Cleveland, as we know, 1970, Kenneth Gibson in Newark, 1973 and 74, it's going to be Maynard Jackson in Atlanta and Coleman Young in Detroit and others. It's going to take really black power militants to be part of a core group of activists who help build a new urban political machine, right? And that's a machine that's based on racial solidarity, all the way up until Harold Washington's Chicago, which is the Chicago that a young Barack Obama encounters when he first moves there in the early 1980s. So when we think about, and we could talk about this when we're doing the moderation, so I'll close. When we think about Barack Obama, one of the things that I would argue, even though the candidate himself would never say this, is that he's an outcome of both that civil rights legacy, and people talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and the beloved community, but he's an outcome of the civil rights legacy and both sides, both the mainstream civil rights legacy, but also the Kingian legacy of radical democracy. Between 65 and 68, King is one of the most vociferous critics of American society, right? He's not a popular man when he's assassinated. The New York Times is calling him a buffoon for coming out against the Vietnam War, even though he's got a Ph.D. and is a Nobel Prize winner, right? Obama is coming out of the legacy of both that civil rights movement, but also that black power movement as well. That black power movement which talked about audacious power, which talked about radical political self-determination, and which also talked about redefining not just black identity, but American identity. One of the reasons why black power was so threatening to so many people was that it forced a re-examination of what we meant by citizenship and humanity. So again, in closing, when we think about this legacy of Obama, we've got to think about a politics of race, but not a politics of race that cannot be transcended, but a politics of race that can also speak towards the universal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph. Thank you also to Professor Gilens, and thank you to Professor French and Professor Williams for helping to put this together. What we'd like to do is give a chance for people to open up questions and get discussion going. We would very much appreciate it if you would do it by coming down to the microphones so that we can record your questions, so that the people who aren't here, who might possibly check it out on our website or some of the other websites on which we might post this, could possibly benefit from the discussion. While I wait for whoever will first come down to the microphone to come down to the microphone, I'd like to pose a question, which is, I came up with a topic for this and put it in terms of racial politics, but both the terms racial politics and especially the term race have some questions about definition, particularly race. Sharona Hoffman of our law school has argued that race should not even be a category in the law because it doesn't have any really defensible referent in actual individual people. So I'd just like to ask both of our speakers, what do you mean by race or by racial politics?
Yeah, thanks.
Well, see, now the rest of you don't have to worry about asking a question that's too tough or anything, so.
Well, that is an important question, and it's one that, as you know, has received an enormous amount of attention without, I think, really coming to any sort of a resolution or a consensus. I mean, the simple thing is to say race is a social construct, and undeniably that's true. It's something that exists to the extent that it exists in our minds. That doesn't mean that there isn't something out in the real world that would exist whether we were aware of it or recognized it or not. There are biological differences among individuals, and there are biological differences among groups, and if you talk to people in the medical world, they will tell you a variety of ways in which people from different races differ and in which treatment protocols and so on depend upon something that is related to what we usually think of in a social context as race. On the other hand, the neat categorization of people into discrete categories is clearly not what maps onto whatever biological underpinnings there may be. And yet that is the sort of social form that race typically has taken. But to get more directly to your question, what do I mean by race? For me as a political scientist, it's important to recognize the fluidity and the sort of multiple perspectives that people in a given society have about race. But it's also important to recognize what the beliefs are at any given point in time, because those are the things that motivate political responses. And that's probably the thing that I focus on mostly, is trying to understand in the vernacular how citizens in the United States are using these categories to make sense of their social and political world, and to reflect as best I can those understandings in the sort of work that I do, whether it's based on surveys or analysis of the media or whatnot.
So in your interpretation, race is a category that people use in talking about other people and about social events, and you're basically just sort of looking at how they use that category as a matter of political rhetoric and structuring political cleavages and so on.
Yes, that's right. And it's important to the extent that people recognize and respond to it that way. But even if we were, somehow to wake up and, like Stephen Colbert, not see race anymore, that wouldn't mean that existing inequalities would have disappeared, right? So there's a bit of a catch-22 here when we say that we are imposing a racial vision on society. There's truth in that, and yet because that understanding, that racial vision has consequences, we can't just wish it away.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, because now we're getting into theory and not necessarily history. I mean, there's good historical sociology, Michael Omi, Howard Wynant, of course, David Theo Goldberg, different philosophers and theorists who looked at race and the notion of racialization. Briefly, I'd say the way in which I conceptualize race as a historian is by looking at history and examining history. And when you think about this notion of race, we're really thinking about it, and the way we apply it is sort of an updated, even if it attempts to be transgressive, vision of something that comes out of the modernist project. So what comes out of the modernist project when it comes to colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade is this idea of race. I agree with Professor Gilens, is that it's fluid, it's not fixed. Some people have at times wanted to fix it. And the notion of socially constructed, though, my problem when people say that is that everything is. So I think there's a big problem with that. I think that was like a postmodern linguistic term, late 80s, early 90s. Everybody was reading Derrida, and we were reading Discipline and Punish by Foucault, and Americans thought they were smarter than they are. So we started to do it too. And I think everything's socially constructed. So that's not to me a big, profound thing. But in terms of its historical construction, it's really going to be a line of demarcation between what its originators and innovators say are different kinds of human beings, different species of human beings. And what we've all done, whether we're in Europe or the United States, but as Americans we have a very specific and peculiar history about race because of slavery, is really updated those definitions, right? And again, I mean, one of the interesting things, the work on whiteness and the work on racialization will argue, whether it's David Roediger or Ian Hanley Lopez and different aspects of whiteness, you know, how the Irish became white, how the Jews became white, how the Italians became white, and argue that this notion of whiteness has not always been as fixed as we may think. And even the category of whiteness is now at its most expansive sort of post-Nuremberg, right, where everybody who at least doesn't look black, except for Tiger Woods, he's the exception, everybody can be white as long as you don't look, as long as you can pass for white. So when you think about race in that context, it is real and more than socially constructed in terms of its impact on people's lives.
One of the things that strikes me is that back in the 1920s, Jews and Italians were part of the swarthy races. And there was all sorts of notions of biological determinism, phrenology, and so on going around. But somehow it seems to me that when we talk about race in the United States, and there's very common language about, the curse of race, our history of race relations, and so on, while there has been plenty of discrimination against Chinese and Japanese and so on, it really seems to me to be in large measure about slavery and the political history of slavery. And when I ask myself, what is Obama talking about when he talks about race, it seems to me that it's the relationship between people who are descendants of slaves and or look like they could be descendants of slaves or have a history of being treated like descendants of slaves, and people who are descendants of slave masters or look like they could possibly be, or at least they couldn't have been slaves. And the reason I phrase it that way and pose that is that there's the politics of race in the United States is fraught with notions of guilt and grievance, and it seems to me to be fraught with notions of the effects of legal restrictions and of how people were treated in the past or how their parents were treated in the past. And one of the weird things about Barack Obama, as an example, is, of course, I suppose if his father actually went to a restaurant in Washington, he would have been treated differently. But on the whole, he finds himself, he is black, even though he's actually African American, right? He's not descended from slaves at all, but the fact that he's black means that he feels that he's looked at differently, even in Hawaii. And I guess the question is, what is the sort of historical dimension of the attitudes here, such that somehow black versus white, or whatever you want to call those two categories, is different from other dimensions and is viewed as less fixable, as of a more persistent problem. What is that? Why is that? Because I think racial politics is based on the notion that there are consequences, and it's not just consequences for whether you get to be elected president. I think racial politics is based on a notion that there are consequences in everyday life of being black, and consequences from public policies to redress that for people who aren't black. In other words, a lot of the resentments of public policy have been based on the idea that it favored some people at the expense of other people. So I just wonder if you have comments on that, the sort of public policy dimension and the historical everyday life dimension of racial politics, and how that plays out, and why it would play out any differently with a black president, if at all. Sorry.
You ask very hard questions. The only thing I'll say is that, I think you're right that historically racial politics in this country has been this black-white dichotomy, but that is changing and will change more in the future as the proportions of other minority groups increase relative to African Americans, and as we become a country where whites are no longer the majority. And I think that is going to have important impact on the dynamics of racial politics, and indeed it has already in places where those changes are furthest along. And I think one of the impacts that it has is to move exactly away from the old notion of racial politics as a zero-sum game, and not to eliminate but to de-emphasize some of that historical grounding that has traditionally been, I think, a dominant role in racial politics in this country. So I think you're right about the origins, but I'm not sure that that will continue on into the next decades.
Just along that line, can I get you to comment on the Latino vote for Obama? Because there was a lot of speculation during the primaries that Latinos would be more likely to go for Clinton, that that there was a potential rivalry there, and yet it doesn't appear to have played out that way at all in the election.
No, quite the contrary. I don't have an explanation, but it's very clear that Latinos were extremely enthusiastic about Obama, and in fact, among all the demographic groups, Obama, if you compare the 2004 Democratic presidential vote to 2008, Latinos were one of the groups where Obama did better than Kerry compared to others. And there may be some specific things having to do with immigration politics that are part of that, but that may very well also be something that carries forward into the future. So this sort of concern about black Latino political strife, while it's certainly very real in certain places and in certain dimensions, certainly did not appear in that way in the 2008 presidential race.
Yeah, briefly, the continuum in terms of racial politics, I think certainly we're beyond the dichotomy, but I think that one of the reasons why people always get caught in the black-white binary is that to the extent that African Americans historically, or blacks, diasporic blacks in the U.S. have elevated themselves, it has a reverberating effect on other people of color, which is why at times there's been coalitions between blacks and even blacks and Japanese, blacks and Latinos. I'm not saying consistent, but at times. When it comes to the Latino vote, I think one of the things we'd have to check demographically is that there's people who they're counting as Latinos who view themselves as Afro-Latinos. You know, there's Latinos from Central America. I know Cubanos who, Cuban Americans who are American citizens who, depending on the range of the skin color, some identify as both Spanish and black, while others identify basically as Anglo, right? They see themselves as white even though they're Spanish speakers. And I think it would be interesting to break them down demographically in terms of that robust 67% who voted for Obama.
Sir. It was supposed to be.
The hip-hop youth group, there's a term that says, don't let what define you confine you. And when I think about black, in conjunction with as universe, I think about consciousness, black as a state of consciousness. And we're talking about consciousness. It's consciousness that can empower or inspire a person. Now, I work out of my insanity to save myself. And the reason I say that, because education has made me somewhat insane. That's my psychosis. But on the same token, as we generate a little conversation around this subject, black, then I have to embrace what that means in the totality. And from the aspect of embracing who is my father's father, my mother's mother, and so on, to function as a whole being on the planet, function as a whole being. And that will somehow, I think, embellish my humanity. I think it's a human problem when we still have, Dr. King said something, if I can quote him, he said, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to study war anymore. Now, he said that for when will nations not study war, kind of thing. Now, when black people, or African American people, or Negro people, which we all been defined out of this so-called social system, that when they begin to turn to love on themselves, that they turn on all the races, then they'll be looked upon a little differently. Self-love. And to see black as perfect, I have not read that in Noah Daniel Webster's dictionary as it's defined as dismal, wicked, demonic. So I'm saying if we see ourselves in society, or see ourselves in lives from the standpoint of something that is profane, something that is great, then you aspire to that from how you see yourself, how society is depicting it. But if you're always seeing yourself from, as I stroll through the neighborhood, there's a brother, you don't see his face, but he's in a prayerful state with a martini bottle in between his legs. And there's another brother that he's architecture downtown, and this is a billboard downtown. He's shooting pool and with a bottle of Hennessy next to him. Now, I ask myself, well, what do these things have to do with him being successful as an architect, a bottle of Hennessy? Well, these things are disparities in the African-American neighborhoods, and I'm believing a little bit, but they want to call it an empowerment zone. I grew up in the African-American neighborhood, Quincy Avenue. I grew up there all my life. I know when those vacant lots were not always vacant lots, when there were African-American businesses there. So, but they want to call it an empowerment zone. When I say, and I'm going to end here, when I say that it's not an empowerment zone just for me to sit down when they have a park there to look at boarded up buildings. I think there have to be something, and something more like when I strolled to the neighborhood 89th and Huff, where the riots and the crack and all that situation was saturated, I saw a fountain of water outside somebody's house. And I said to myself, that's consciousness. Someone's thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to push one aspect of that, which is a couple. One is, that occurred to me, one is, what is the blackness? Well, what does Obama say about what it means in people's consciousness to be black? Is there any way one can talk about that? Well, people talk about, Michael Jordan and, or Malcolm X. In other words, public figures at some level represent groups to people. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. But for instance, I suspect when I was growing up in the Jewish community of Boston, Leonard Bernstein, right? Does Obama represent something new or different or a change or a challenge, or does he represent?
Yeah, no, obviously he represents. What I fear is that what people, and I've heard even some people in the black community saying this, and white folks as well, it's like sort of Obama's the new face, meaning that it's a subtler it's a subtler version of the Bill Cosby argument in terms of telling these black folks to just clean yourselves up and pull yourselves up by the bootstrap. And remember, Cosby in the NAACP speech in 2004 famously basically blasted poor blacks, saying that they had failed to live up to their part of the civil rights revolution. They were having babies out of wedlock. They were prone to criminality. It sounded very much like an indictment on people who were poor, and basically saying they're using race as an excuse. And I think there's a fear, or I think what's plausible is the use of Barack Obama as sort of this bludgeon to say, well, stay in school and be this sort of perfect assimilated African American, as if that never existed before, as if there was never intelligent, clean-cut, responsible African Americans. So I think what's interesting is in his book, Dreams of My Father, he talks about searching for his own vision of black identity. Initially he looks for it on the playground with black folks playing basketball. He talks about a friend of his grandfather who was African American, who was a militant. He looks for it there. He goes to Occidental, and he looks for it among black students who are anti-apartheid activists. He seeks it at Columbia. And eventually, he basically finds it in two places. He finds it in Chicago among community activists, but also Trinity United Church, and that might scare people. Mm-hmm. He finds it in Chicago among both the Altgeld Gardens homes, which are projects, which he's an organizer of for 3 years, but also at Trinity United. I mean, Trinity United, their slogan was unapologetically black and Christian. And that's where Fox News was like, what do they mean, unapologetically black? Fox News is, it's like these black people are like crazy. And he also finds it in Africa. The longest section of that book is not the Chicago part or the Hawaii and Indonesia part. Dreams from My Father, it's Kenya. He finds, and I think it's in Kenya where he kind of comes to reconcile all these parts of himself and says he doesn't have to be sort of the most militant black man, and he doesn't have to sort of be a caricature of what it's like to be black. And what I hope is that when people say, okay, is Barack Obama one way of being black? Obviously. And is it a new way of being black? Really, honestly, no, except empirically, we've never had a black person like that be president. There's always been Barack Obamas as teachers, as professors, as lawyers. They've always existed. But have they ever been president? No. So that's going to be something new and empowering to the extent that we have so many rap artists and athletes, and that's usually what, at least at the mass level, people are aspiring to. But it can also be disempowering if he's used as an icon of a kind of tepid assimilation, right? Instead of being an iconography that continues to push American democracy in progressive ways, it's the icon of what you can do if you just play your cards right. And he said it himself. He found that if he smiled and was polite to older white people, including his mother, they were really astonished and happy. Because he was black, and he found the self-discipline at 10 and 12 not to exhibit any anger or any black rage. Remember, Greer and Cobbs were the black psychologists who had the 1972 book, Black Rage. What does that mean? So I think his vision and version of being black is important, but there's a duality there. One is very progressive, and another is not.
Sir.
I was just wondering to what extent Barack Obama's being a national leader either helps or hinders him in being a black leader. Now, it's like he has to be cognizant of the wishes of not only white folks in general, but the predominantly white power structure. And I mean, look, there is really a need for black leadership, isn't there? I mean, it's like slavery is alive and well and living in the prison industrial complex. I mean, as you pointed out earlier about drugs in the community, I mean, they're still there in record numbers. Police brutality is still way up, and there's still a great disparity in income between blacks and whites in this country. So I mean, to what extent does Barack Obama's being a national leader either help or hinder him in being a black leader?
Really quickly, I don't think he is a black leader anymore in that same advocacy kind of way, and I think the black community is going to find that out rather quickly, right? So I think he's a national leader, and I think blacks, Latinos, and different groups, I won't call them special interest groups because that's used as such a slur these days, but different groups, or interest groups, I won't say special interests, but different interest groups are going to have to approach him like the President of the United States and try to cajole and threaten and convince in order to get their agendas. I think one of the things I write about, and this is a plug for my new book, right? The forthcoming book, From Black Power to Barack Obama, is that the strange situation African Americans find themselves in, and leadership as well, is that you usually, for lack of a better word, have a President of the United States, but you also have a president of black America, historically, right? In one context, it's Frederick Douglass. In another, it's W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, really, you know. In another, it's obviously Dr. King, a real leader for the community. And in another, I know people have disparaged his reputation in the last decade or so, but Jesse Jackson in the 1980s is remarkable in terms of 3.5 million votes in the primaries in '84 and then 6.7 million in '88. The danger of Obama, and we're already feeling it, is that he's the first person ever to be President of the United States, and he's the boss of black America, right? 95% vote, really an undying loyalty and an unyielding loyalty by a lot of people who voted for him, very excited about him, but he doesn't have to do anything for that constituency. And really, as a national leader, he's really loath to do anything specifically for that constituency. Now, he's going to do things that a rising tide lifts all boats and help them through collateral legislation. But the only way black leaders are going to really get anything tangible from Obama in a race-specific way is to somehow develop enough political leverage to force the President of the United States, who happens to be black, to go to this agenda. And Latinos the same way, right? But again, for blacks, it's a real conundrum because we've never had this before, you know. And we're going to see. I mean, Tavis Smiley criticized him during the campaign and was the vitriol from the black community was such that we didn't have a mature public sphere, because Tavis was called an Uncle Tom and a traitor for criticizing Obama. And we've got the right to criticize him, right? This is a democracy. But the black community is very protective of him, and he knows that. So on one level, he's turned people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, he's lowered their relevancy. He's the first president who doesn't need a broker to get to the black community. If Hillary had been president, the black agenda arguably actually has more valence in a Clinton administration than an Obama administration, because they're taking black folks for granted in an Obama administration. And we've already seen that. It's going to be a tricky situation the next 4 years.
It's really quite an interesting situation that way, because he almost can't be an advocate explicitly for black America. No. It's almost like that's the one thing he can't do in a way that Lyndon Johnson could do it. Right? Marty, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I was going to make that point, and also that whatever legislation comes out at the federal level that Obama supports that is particularly beneficial to African Americans is going to be in this sort of a race-neutral framework. And that may be very important, and it may, have to do with criminal justice and health care and urban policy and so on. And so not to disparage those efforts, but I think it's not going to be racially specific.
No, it's not.
What does that do to the, I mean, at one point it was possible to talk about what a black agenda might be, or how you would help the black community or whatever. How do you talk about that with the President Obama? Is it just something that happens in Congress, and so it doesn't matter that there's a President Obama, or what?
I think, again, it's advocacy groups. The NAACP, which obviously is a nonpartisan group officially for their tax-exempt status, but obviously they registered millions of voters or thousands of voters, and many of those voters voted for Obama. They're going to be in a really rough situation in terms of trying to advocate for an African-American agenda, like, again, when it comes to crime, when it comes to a real urban agenda for poor folks in the inner city, when it comes to employment discrimination. I think on one level there's certain federal positions that will be filled which will help facilitate that agenda. But on another level, if we're really going to stamp out discrimination, we can't just pretend it doesn't exist or that it's disappeared because you've got a President Obama. So there's aspects of this presidency that may reinforce the notion of colorblind racism. And colorblind racism, all that means is that we've decided and we say through fiat and not public policy that we're all equal. That's what colorblind racism. People ask me, how do you define that? What we do is say, well, there was all this legacy of racial discrimination, but now, and we did affirmative action for 40 years, but guess what? We're equal. I've decided. So there's no more need, and we can extend that to women too. We don't need affirmative action for them. It's a level playing field, and we may get that. I'm not sure. I think the bulwark between that and President Obama is a robust grassroots black activism, and we'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
Jim.
I have a little bit different question, I think. On your slides about showing attitudes as a function of age, young people look like they have a better understanding in a lot of ways than people who are 65. And I guess I have a couple questions. One is, are the people who are now 65 less tolerant than they were when they were 18? I would guess the answer is no. And so then I'm curious about what is it in the experience of the younger group now that makes them have a different set of attitudes than the people who are 65. And what I'm really wondering is, in some ways, did busing work? Has an intimate exposure broken down to where people look at each other as members of a group and they have more of a chance of looking at each other as individuals? Is there anything along those lines?
It's a great question. People who are 65 now have actually become more racially tolerant since they were younger, but not at the same pace at which the younger generations who were coming in became more racially tolerant, and so the gap has widened. What's the cause of that? Boy, that's another tough question. I mean, clearly, part of it is sort of elite-led, and it kind of like trickles down in attitudes that stem from government, from political leaders. That doesn't really, it sort of begs the question of, well, what made those attitudes change? I mean, clearly, African Americans' political activism themselves was a big part of it. People point to World War II. I mean, there's probably 1,000 social factors that contributed to changing racial practices and attitudes, which, of course, reinforce each other. Whether busing contributed in a positive way, I don't know. It probably had both positive and negative effects on race relations. But I do think it's those kinds of things, that hundreds of them really accumulating over time, that have led to these generational differences, as well as changes in the media, which is where many non-black Americans have the most exposure to blacks, right? It's through both fictional media and news media. And there's been changes in how African Americans are portrayed in those forums as well over the decades.
I should point out there was an article in I think it's the Times or the Post the other day, which argued that Hollywood prepared this. Think of how many movies have a black president, and the black president is always like Morgan Freeman, which when you compare Morgan Freeman to George Bush, I mean it's to a lot of people a little more plausible, right? So there is a media side to this in terms of just the portrayals in popular culture. But
we were talking about this with the grad students earlier. I think the media side is there, but vis-a-vis President Obama, I think it's exaggerated. Vis-a-vis what this question was talking about, I don't think it's exaggerated. But I wouldn't say media, and I have a little different perspective. I don't think it's top-down in this sense. I think the reason why we've got 18 and 20-year-olds and 25-year-olds who went gaga over Obama has to do with things like popular culture and music and hip-hop, and a feeling that there's a generation of whites, and again, I think when you trend along people who went to college and who have some kind of education or exposure, because I'm not sure empirically if busing worked, because it becomes You'd have to look at city by city, and not just Boston, but North Carolina, New York, other places. You'd have to do local case studies to see when it started, when it stopped, and really track that community. I think in a larger context, younger people, their racial attitudes, even from the time I was growing up in New York City, where Howard Beach happened and Do the Right Thing was the movie of the summer in 1989 when I was 17. These things have changed, and one of the biggest aspects of it has been popular culture, but specific music, and not just, people talk about the 60s and soul music and R&B. Hip-hop has had a much bigger impact on race relations than jazz and soul music and funk music. It just has, because part of what happened through hip-hop culture was an attempt to adopt a certain kind of lifestyle that people connected with urban America. And it's interesting because there's a class component here, because even African Americans who are in suburbs learned or tried to identify with black culture through hip-hop in a very specific way. On one level, you had certain suburbanites like De La Soul who were fine that they were from the suburbs, but then you also have folks who are from the suburbs who want to be 50 Cent, and they want to be gangsters, black, white, Latino. So one of the most amazing aspects, even my students at Brandeis University, I think their racial attitudes have progressed to the point that it's not that they don't see race. They really do see race, right? And it's not that there's no racism, but they actually disaggregate between different kinds of racial minorities. So they look at Obama and they say, you know what, I understand exactly who this guy is, where your 65-year-old, unless very specific, doesn't have a context for Obama. They're saying, who is this black guy? And what do you mean he went to Columbia and Harvard? Because I didn't even go to college, or I went to Scranton, Scranton State in Pennsylvania, and this means nothing to me. Where younger people could really identify with him, and younger black and white people. Vibe magazine had him on the cover in 2007 in a very sort of iconographic photo that showed you sort of the way in which, again, hip-hop becomes the lingua franca in a way for some of this stuff. Political activism as well. But I don't think it's not.
I would only comment that I would be skeptical that busing were a major factor, because the level of educational segregation in the United States is actually quite high, partly because of the white flight, partly, both into private schools and to suburbs with fewer black folk in them than the inner city, or then to further out suburbs with fewer black folk in them than the inner ring suburbs. And so it'd be interesting to see data on how many, the proportion of white kids who actually had many black kids, at younger ages. I mean, I think there's somewhat more of it than there was, but it would be hard for me to, I'd be skeptical that busing was that successful at actually integrating.
I get it.
But
I accept that. I mean, my kids go to Shaker Heights, which is a pretty successfully integrated school, and so maybe it's not typical. But the general question I'm trying to figure out is, how do we go from looking at groups of people to looking at people as individuals? So, but
yeah,
thanks.
That's a great question. And John,
I had two questions. One, I was curious. I know you had shown the graph of showing, I think it was solely, if I understand correctly, Republican attitudes towards race, and I was kind of curious if there was a corresponding graph for Democratic Party attitudes, because, kind of going into my second part of the question, and when I was watching the news, especially framed around Hillary Clinton, there was this perspective that older Democrats, had racist attitudes to varying extents, and I'm sure that's true, and I'm just really curious to what extent like a real graph of people voting would match up to how it was reported on.
Okay, as far as the first part of your question, the graphs were showing the proportion of people who said that they would prefer the Republican presidential candidate as opposed to the Democratic presidential candidate.
So it wasn't just of Republicans.
Republicans who were being surveyed, it was people of all political orientations. There's no question that there are racist Democrats and Democrats who have a whole range of negative attitudes towards blacks that we may or may not want to call racist, but which we might not be too happy about. And that's true, and there are, as a proportion, fewer of them than there are among Republicans, at least based on the survey data, and that's probably a factor of sorting as the parties diverged on racial policy, that people with the most negative attitudes towards blacks left the Democratic Party. And I didn't quite catch the very last part of your question.
Well, he was kind of speaking to something that was my perception, or I guess maybe to rephrase it, that when I was watching news stories, that I definitely had this perception that there was a real lot of skepticism of victory. Like at one point, it was just this constant questioning: will Americans, but like also specifically, it was raised with, will older Jews vote for Obama? Will X group vote for Obama?
Well, and
actually, even will blacks vote for Obama?
But one group was raised with, certainly with Jews. Another was older Jews, and so you had this wonderful Sarah Silverman stuff about go tell your booby to that if she in Florida, that if she doesn't vote for Obama, you'll stop visiting her. And then you also, but you had much of the McCain campaign was based on the assumption that Hillary Clinton, older Hillary Clinton voters, white voters in Pennsylvania, wouldn't end up voting for Obama. And my read of Marty's data was that there might have been some of that, but what everybody in Pennsylvania who was looking at Pennsylvania who wasn't a McCain campaign analyst was saying was that, but all those other people, the Philadelphia suburbs, are going to vote for Obama. And that appears to be what happened, is that there are some white, less educated, more working class or whatever, older, who voted for Hillary and didn't vote for Obama. But there's a whole lot of other people who were Republicans 20 years ago, perhaps, in the Philadelphia suburbs who did. Am I reading that right, Marty and Peniel?
No, that's absolutely right.
And in terms of exit polls, when it comes to that question, if you look at the 50-state exit polls right after the election, he did pretty well with white voters. The lowest percentage of white vote in a state he won was North Carolina with about 37%. Highest was 60+ in Maine. In Pennsylvania, he got 50% of the white vote. Colorado, high 40s. The places he did extraordinarily bad and weak in was the old Confederacy. So places like Alabama, it's going to be 22%. Kentucky, West Virginia, even Florida, he got 41% and won that. Ohio, it was in the 40s in Ohio. So he didn't do as bad with the white vote, even though nationally it comes out to 43%. It's a much higher ratio if you just look at the 29 states he won. Right? And then you also look at states like Missouri, which he lost by about 6,000 votes, still got about 45% of the white vote. So the notion that en masse whites were lying to pollsters in all 50 states, and then also smaller aggregates in terms of cities and towns, was always absurd. But it was a great line. It was a great narrative to say, hey, this is not a done deal, and these white folks aren't going to vote for him. But the notion that collectively, and even blacks, that's what I'm saying, the black public sphere needed maturity here, too, because one of the good things about New York Times, Washington Post, when they're looking at this election wrap-up, they looked at controversies within black families where older black folks who were like, this ain't ever going to happen, and it was really... There was real divides with younger blacks who were in their 30s saying, why are you so pessimistic? It doesn't mean that we're not realistic about racism, but why can't he win? And to the point where families weren't speaking to each other. Even up until election night, there were certain folks who, and again, part of this is their own bitterness and experience with America. They've been disappointed constantly. They didn't think it could happen, but empirically, it would have almost been impossible based on what the polling we saw and the outcome, which basically was in line with what we thought it would be, for him not to have won. It would have had to take something bigger than, I think, just race.
I should point out, by the way, that 43% of the white vote is awfully darn good for a Democratic candidate post-1964.
Absolutely.
You get the last question, sir.
Okay. So the question is, so lately, comedians around the country, they're complaining that we have a hard time making fun of Barack Obama because, as a black person, and then partially also because, he's like much smarter than George W. Bush, I think. So as a way, so you guys have any like inspirations or like suggestions for those comedians to make fun of Obama at the same time and then not being as racist?
I don't think I want to touch that one.
I think, the thing is, I think the thing about making fun of him, it's fine. I just think that what they're looking for is an avenue to make fun that's not explicitly racial. And I think that just shows us how, when it comes to our humor, even when people are trying to be sardonic and trying to be ironic, when it comes to humor connected to black people, it's always based in a lowest common denominator that traffics in stereotypes and caricature, right? And that's the easiest thing to do, right? I mean, Richard Pryor did it, and he was brilliant, right? So I think that's what they're looking for. They're looking actually for a lingua franca. I remember when I was in Philadelphia in graduate school, there was a famous, and it was a liberal cartoonist, and there was two panels. A student came up to the teacher and said, "The dog ate my homework," and the teacher was upset and knew the student was lying. And the second panel, the student came up to the teacher and said, "A black guy stole my homework," and like attacked me. And the teacher grabs him and is like, "You poor dear." And both of them are whoppers, but the teacher believed, and there was a huge controversy because many black people felt that was racist. I understood what the cartoonist was trying to do. The cartoonist actually was sending an anti-racist message, just like All in the Family with Archie Bunker. But most people interpreted that second panel as the truth. Many people said, yeah, black people do harm people and they are violent. Like Archie Bunker. Norman Lear was a card-carrying ACLU member. He created Archie Bunker to lampoon a certain kind of backward-minded Queens Village racism. And I grew up in Queens, so I know. Most Americans didn't read Archie Bunker that way. Most Americans really applauded Archie Bunker and identified with Archie Bunker. So with Obama, it's going to be, how can we find humor in him that doesn't traffic in stereotypes about black intelligence, about black sexuality, about black, humanity, even if it's to make an anti-racist point.
I think the Republicans already tried to do it in a non-racist way by talking about this guy who's just so articulate, and he's a rock star, and he's a professor, and he goes on, and you may find some of that as sort of a first attempt. That and the ears. I think they may try the ears, but I really do think it's going to be that he's so articulate, and the hero worship of him. I think that's going to be used, and to the extent that the Daily Show and so on is doing it at all, I think that's what they're doing. I want to leave you with one more emphasis, if I may. When I read Dreams of My Father, and as I watched Barack Obama, one thing that struck me was that Barack Obama did not seem to have a passion about any particular policy area. He's not identified with health care the way Teddy Kennedy is, for example, or Hillary, or with education the way some politicians are, or with transportation or the environment. He talks about things, but none of them seem to grab him in a special way. But if you read Dreams of My Father, what seemed to grab him was the concept of empowerment. He did not go to be a community organizer to fix any particular ills. He was there to be a community organizer to empower. And you've used the word empower a few times here. It just keeps coming up. And I think it's worth just thinking about what the concept of empowerment means in the context of race relations in the United States. Who needs to be empowered? What people don't have power over? How power differs. It is very clear that one of the things that Barack Obama cares about intensely is inequalities of power. In his account of of living in Indonesia, his stepfather in Indonesia teaches him about what the powerful can do to the not so powerful, and how you have to maneuver around the powerful, and how you must always be strong. So one of the interesting things about Obama is that he thinks in terms of power and its inequalities, I think, as much as he thinks in terms of any particular policy. And I'm curious about what that will mean going down the road, both for his presidency and, if you think about empowerment, what that means for racial politics more generally. The other thing that strikes me thinking about Obama is one article quoted him as saying that he was part of the Joshua generation. And the Joshua generation, in the sense that, Dr. King and others were part of the Moses generation, and they never got to the promised land, and so on. But what struck me about the idea of the Joshua generation was, it's not clear to me who's on the journey. If we think in terms of racial politics as a journey, of race relations as a journey, as there being a land of exile and a land of promise, then it doesn't seem to me a journey that only the black, African American, Negro, colored, whatever you want to call it, population of the United States is on. That it seems to me to be a journey that we're all supposed to be on. Thank you, Professor Gilens, and thank you, Professor Joseph. And Professor Joseph has one last comment.
Only the first two are acceptable, black and African American.
Okay, just
okay. So everybody gets that. Right. Only the first two.
Okay. But the journey, part of the journey, actually, is the naming, and who gets to name, right? Who gets to even name the categories? Anyway, thank you all very much.